the first time Marcus Ramsey burned a loaf of bread so badly that the smoke could be seen from 3 lots away. The widow Calloway laughed so hard she nearly fell off her porch railing, and Marcus decided right then and there that he did not care one single bit, because the only person whose opinion mattered to him was the woman standing at the far end of Durango's Main Street, watching the smoke curl up into the wide Colorado sky with an expression that was caught somewhere between alarm and pure, unguarded amusement. Her name was Maude Rhodes, and Marcus Ramsey had been quietly, desperately, absolutely gone over her since the first morning she arrived in Durango in the spring of 1882. He had been leaning against the post of the livery stable, watching the southbound stage roll in the way he did most mornings, when the dust and silence of his small cattle operation left him with nowhere particular to be before noon, and she had stepped down from that coach with a carpetbag in each hand and a hatbox balanced under one arm, and the morning light had caught the auburn in her brown hair and turned it the color of new copper. And Marcus had straightened up so fast he knocked the back of his head against the post behind him. He stood there rubbing his skull, watching her scan the street with sharp brown eyes that took in everything at once, and he thought he had never seen a woman look so entirely self-possessed and so entirely alone at the same time. She had come from St. Louis, he learned later. Everyone in Durango learned about everyone else within 48 hours. It was simply the nature of a town of 400 souls pressed together between mountains and red rock. She had inherited a small house from her uncle, a man named Maude Rhodes, who had run a boot repair shop on Elm Street for 11 years before his heart gave out in February. Maude Rhodes was 26 years old, unmarried, and she had no intention, she told Mrs. Calloway over the front fence on her second day in town, of being anyone's charity case. She intended to open the boot shop back up herself. The whole town had an opinion about that, naturally. In 1882, a woman running a leather trade shop alone was not exactly common practice in southwestern Colorado. The men at the Silver Horn Saloon had placed bets about how long she would last before she sold the place or found herself a husband. The bets ranged from 3 weeks to 3 months. Nobody bet longer than that. Marcus Ramsey did not go inside the Silver Horn to hear those bets, but he heard about them from his ranch hand, a lean, good-natured young man named Pete Doyle who had a weakness for gossip and cold beer. Marcus listened, said nothing, and spent the rest of that evening sitting on the fence of his cattle pen watching the stars come out over the San Juan Mountains, thinking about a woman with copper-bright hair and steady eyes who had come 900 miles to prove something. He respected that more than he could say. Marcus was 31 years old in the spring of 1882. He had come to Colorado 8 years earlier with $40, a horse, and the particular stubborn ambition that grows in men who have spent their childhoods being told they will not amount to much. His father had been a drunk in eastern Kansas. His mother had been a saint who deserved better, and Marcus had left at 19 with her blessing and a packed bedroll and had never looked back east. He had hired himself out as a ranch hand, then a trail driver, then a cattle buyer, and by 1882 he owned 60 head of cattle, a modest house 3 miles north of Durango on good grass, and a reputation as a quiet, honest, capable man who kept his word and never started trouble. He had good hands, calloused and wide, built for rope and fence wire, and the daily hard work of keeping animals alive on the frontier. What those hands had absolutely never done, not once in 31 years, was bake anything at all. The idea came to him in the most embarrassing way possible. He had ridden into town on a Tuesday afternoon in late April to pick up a spool of barbed wire from the hardware store, and he had walked past the boot repair shop and noticed that the sign Maude had painted herself was hanging slightly crooked, tilted maybe 15 degrees to the left, and he had stopped in the street and stared at it and thought, I could fix that for her. It would take 2 minutes. I have a hammer in my saddlebag right now. He stood in the street for 4 full minutes and did not move, Because what would he say? He could not walk up and knock on her door and say, "Ma'am, your sign is tilted," as if she did not have eyes in her head. She had eyes that noticed everything. She would know he had been looking. She would know he had stopped specifically to look at her sign. And then she would look at him with those steady brown eyes, and he would become a complete and total fool. He rode home with the barbed wire and without speaking to Maude Rhodes. This pattern continued for 2 weeks. He found 17 different reasons to ride past her shop. He could not think of a single believable reason to stop. Pete Doyle watched this with increasing amusement and decreasing patience. By the second week, Pete had started making commentary. "You going to town again?" Pete asked on a Thursday morning, leaning on a fence post and chewing a piece of dried grass with an expression of exaggerated innocence. "Need nails," Marcus said. "You bought nails Monday." "I need more nails." Pete watched him saddle his horse. "Boss," he said, "I say this with genuine respect. You are the most capable man I have ever worked for. I have seen you pull a calf out of a mud hole in a thunderstorm without breaking a sweat. I have seen you stare down a bull that was fixing to charge and make it blink first. But when it comes to this particular woman, you are absolutely pitiful." Marcus cinched his saddle and said nothing. "You could just talk to her," Pete offered. "About what?" "Anything. The weather, the boots she repairs, the price of leather, anything at all." Marcus swung up into the saddle. "It is not that simple." "Why not?" He looked at Pete for a moment, and then he looked away at the mountains, and he said, very quietly, "Because she is not the kind of woman you just make small talk at. You would understand if you had looked at her for more than 30 seconds. Pete thought about this. He had seen Maude Rhodes. She was, he privately agreed, not exactly the kind of woman who inspired small talk. She inspired a man to want to come to her with something worth saying. The nails story fell apart by Friday when Mrs. Calloway mentioned to Pete in passing that she had seen Marcus buying nails 3 times in 1 week, and that Avery at the hardware store was starting to wonder if the Ramsey ranch had some kind of nail crisis. It was actually Pete who gave Marcus the idea about the bread, and he did it entirely by accident. Pete came back from town on a Saturday with a wrapped parcel from the general store, and when Marcus asked what was in it, Pete said, "Sourdough starter from Heller's store. Mrs. Heller makes her own bread and she sells the starter. I figured I'd try baking my own since you will not let me quit early on Saturdays anymore." Marcus looked at the parcel. He looked at Pete. He looked toward town, which was visible only as a smear of chimney smoke in the distance. "Does everyone make their own bread?" he asked with a studied casualness that did not fool Pete at all. "Most people out here do, yeah. Buy starter, maintain it, bake when you need to." Pete eyed him. "Why?" "No reason." Pete watched his boss walk into the house with the expression of a man whose brain was working very hard, and he shook his head and went to put the starter somewhere cool. By Sunday morning, Marcus had bought his own starter from Mrs. Heller, a recipe card from the same source, a bag of flour, a tin of salt, and a Dutch oven that he did not currently own but which the general store happened to stock. He spread everything on his kitchen table and looked at it all for a long moment. The recipe card said the process took about 4 hours from start to finish. It said the first loaf was often the hardest. It said to be patient. Marcus Ramsey was a patient man by nature. He had spent years learning patience in the saddle, on the trail, at the end of a rope in driving rain. He could be patient about bread. He was not, as it turned out, naturally gifted at bread. The first loaf came out of the Dutch oven looking like something that had been sat upon by a horse. It was flat, it was dense, and when he knocked on the top of it, it made a sound like a rock. He fed it to the dog, a large shaggy hound named Copper, who ate 3 bites, then carried it outside and buried it. Marcus stood in his kitchen and looked at the empty Dutch oven and thought about giving up. Then he thought about Maude Rhodes standing at the door of her shop with copper light in her hair, and he measured another cup of flour. The second loaf was better. It had risen this time, at least partially, and it was edible in the sense that he could chew it without danger to his teeth. Copper ate the whole thing without burying any of it, which Marcus took as a positive sign. The third loaf he brought to Pete as a test subject. Pete ate a piece, chewed slowly, and said, with the diplomatic care of a man who liked being employed, "It is improving." "That is not a compliment," Marcus said. "It is not a complaint either." By the fourth attempt, Marcus was beginning to understand what the dough was supposed to feel like under his hands. The recipe card had said words like elastic and smooth, and he had not known what those meant until his hands found the right tension in the dough on the fourth try and something clicked. He could feel it. The dough came alive under his palms in a way that reminded him, strangely, of the first time he had learned to read the muscles of a horse through the reins. A language communicated through touch. The fourth loaf was good, genuinely good, gold-encrusted and soft inside and smelling of something warm and civilized that his bachelor house had never smelled of before. He stood in the kitchen at 7 in the morning holding a loaf of good bread, and he thought, now what? Now he had a reason to knock on her door. He wrapped the loaf in a clean cloth, put his best hat on, brushed the dust off his coat, and argued with himself for 20 minutes about whether this was a reasonable thing for a grown man to do. Then he put himself on his horse and rode to town. Main Street in Durango on a weekday morning in May of 1882 was a busy and cheerful place. The town had been established less than 3 years prior, incorporated in 1880 when the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad came through, and it still had the particular energy of a settlement that knew it was becoming something real and permanent. There were proper storefronts now, a hotel, 2 churches, a schoolhouse, the county sheriff's office, a doctor's surgery. The streets were not paved. They were hard-packed dirt that turned to red mud in rain, but there were wooden sidewalks along the main stretch and people used them. Maude's shop, Rhodes Boot Repair, sat between a dry goods store and a land agent's office. The sign, Marcus noted as he tied his horse at the rail, was still slightly crooked. He noticed that she had been too busy to fix it, or perhaps too proud to ask for help with something so minor. He understood both possibilities equally well. He stood at the door of the shop for a moment that lasted approximately 10 years. He could hear movement inside, the sound of tools on leather. He raised his fist and knocked. The sound of work stopped. Footsteps. The door opened. Maude Rhodes was wearing a leather apron over a dark blue dress, and she had a small awl tucked behind her ear the way some women kept pencils, and she was looking at him with those brown eyes that saw everything, and Marcus Ramsey forgot every single word he had planned to say. She looked at the cloth-wrapped bundle in his hands. She looked at his face. She waited, which was something he would come to understand was characteristic of her. She did not fill silences to make other people comfortable. She simply waited and let them find their own way to what they meant to say. "I made bread," he said. "I had extra. I thought you might want it." It was not exactly the speech he had rehearsed, but it was honest, and Maude Rhodes, he would learn, had a very fine-tuned instrument for detecting the difference between honesty and performance. She looked at the bread. She looked at him. "You are Marcus Ramsey," she said. "Your ranch is north of town. You bought nails from Avery 4 times last week." He felt his ears go warm. 3 times, he said with what he hoped was dignity. Something at the corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. The possibility of one. "Come in," she said, and stood back from the door. The shop smelled of leather and lanolin, and the particular warm, dusty smell of a working space that someone has claimed as their own. The front room served as both reception and workspace, with a long wooden counter, a wall of cubbyholes for wading boots and shoes, and a worktable covered in tools and leather scraps and 2 boots in various stages of repair. Everything was organized. Not tidily organized in the way of someone who did not work hard, but functionally organized in the way of someone who knew exactly where everything was and needed to find it quickly. Maude cleared a corner of the counter and set the wrapped bread on it. She unwrapped it with careful hands, and Marcus watched her face when she saw it. She did not gush. She simply looked at it, pressed one finger gently to the crust, and said, "This is a good loaf." "I have been practicing," he said, and then immediately wished he had not said that because it implied this was not the first time, which it was not, but the implication made his reason for practicing quite obvious. She looked at him again. "Would you like coffee?" she said. "I have a small stove in the back room." He said yes, and that was the beginning of everything. They sat in the back room of the boot shop at a small table with two mismatched chairs, and Maude poured black coffee into 2 tin cups, and she cut 2 slices of his bread with a penknife, and they ate and drank and talked. Or rather, Marcus talked, which surprised him because he was not generally a talkative man, but something about the way she listened made talking easy, the way good ground makes walking easy. She listened with her whole face, not just politely waiting for her turn to speak, but actually taking in what he said and turning it over. He told her about his cattle, about the grass on his north pasture, and the problem he had been having with a stretch of fence near the creek that the cattle kept finding their way through. She told him about the boot shop, about the tools her uncle had left, about how leather work was not so different from the sewing her mother had taught her except that it required considerably more force. "Your uncle taught you?" he asked. "By mail," she said. "He would send me letters describing techniques. I have been practicing on my own for 3 years." She glanced at him with a dry look. "People in Durango seem surprised that a woman can repair boots." "People in Durango have opinions about everything," he said carefully. "They do," she agreed. "I heard about the bets at the Silver Horn." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I did not participate in those bets." "I know," she said. "Mrs. Calloway told me. She keeps track of who does what in this town. She says you are a man who minds his own business. Mrs. Calloway is generous. She also says you are the most stubborn man in La Plata County." Maude said this without any softening of the tone, just clean and direct, and he looked at her and saw that the corner of her mouth was doing that thing again, that almost smile. "I prefer the word determined," he said. And Maude Rhodes laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, and it was a sound like water over clean rock. And Marcus Ramsey sat there with his tin coffee cup and thought, "There it is. There is the whole problem. I am completely finished." He left an hour later because she had boots to repair and he had cattle to see to, and the morning air hit him when he stepped out onto the wooden sidewalk, and he stood there for a moment breathing it in. He untied his horse. He looked back at the shop door, which was closed again behind him. He rode home smiling like an absolute fool, and Pete took one look at him when he came through the gate and said, "Well." "Get back to work," Marcus said, and Pete laughed all the way to the fence line. He went back the following Tuesday with another loaf. He told himself it was because he had made it and had extra. This was not entirely untrue. He had been baking every few days, refining his technique, and there genuinely was more bread than one man and one dog could eat. But he wrapped the best loaf in a clean cloth on Tuesday morning, and he went to town and he knocked on her door, and Maude opened it in her leather apron with the awl behind her ear and said, "Good morning, Marcus." And the fact that she used his given name felt like the sun coming out. They had coffee again. And bread. And this time they talked longer, because she had a question about cattle that she had genuinely been curious about, specifically about how a cattle rancher decided which animals to sell and which to keep, and he found himself explaining it with real enthusiasm, because it was something he thought about with real care. She listened and asked smart follow-up questions, and they were 20 minutes deep in a conversation about animal husbandry before either of them seemed to notice how easy it all was. He started coming every Tuesday and Friday. He told Pete it was for supplies. Pete made a sound that was technically not a laugh but occupied the same general territory. On the third week, Maude showed him how to repair a heel. He had brought in one of his own boots, which had a heel that was coming away from the sole, and she had taken it and examined it with a professional eye and said she could fix it in an hour. He had sat in the back room while she worked, which she permitted because she said she did not mind talking while her hands were busy. He watched her work the leather with the awl and the wax thread and the bone folder, her hands quick and certain, and he thought that watching someone do something they were genuinely skilled at was one of the most beautiful things in the world. She worked the repaired heel back onto the boot with small, precise hammer taps and then handed it back to him. 2 cents, she said. That seems low, he said. 2 cents, she repeated in a tone that ended negotiations. He paid her 2 cents and wore the boot home, and stopped on his way out of town to buy a new length of good rope from the hardware store that he absolutely did not need, just to give himself somewhere to walk that was not directly back to his horse, because he needed a moment to decompress from the particular pleasant pressure of being in the same room as Maude Rhodes. The town was noticing. Of course it was. In a town of 400 people, a man who shows up at a woman's shop twice a week with fresh bread is not conducting a secret operation. Mrs. Calloway watched from her porch with undisguised approval. Old Heller at the general store started keeping extra flour in stock because he said business had picked up. The men at the Silver Horn had, Pete reported, mostly given up on their bets because none of them had bet on the scenario where the woman ran the shop successfully and also had a cowboy bringing her bread twice a week. Sheriff Dade, a broad, quiet man named Thomas Dade who had been running La Plata County for 6 years with minimal drama, stopped Marcus on the street one afternoon in June and said without preamble, "That Rhodes woman is decent. Good kind of people, just so you know." Marcus looked at him. "I know," he said. Dade nodded. "Figured," he said, and walked on. June came in hot and dry, the way Colorado summers do, and Marcus expanded his baking repertoire because he could not keep bringing the same loaf of sourdough indefinitely without it beginning to seem like the rut of habit rather than the effort of care. He asked Mrs. Heller about other recipes, and she gave him one for a honey wheat bread that used a smaller proportion of sourdough starter and a larger proportion of whole wheat flour. He tried it on a Sunday afternoon and burned it the first time because the heat in his oven ran hotter than the recipe anticipated, and the second time he got a good loaf, dense and slightly sweet, darker than the white sourdough. He brought it on a Friday and Maude unwrapped it and looked at it with bright eyes and said, "This is different." "Honey wheat," he said. "I am expanding my education." She looked at him with a look that was no longer almost smile. It was an actual one, warm and direct and entirely unguarded, and she said, "Marcus Ramsey, I think you might be the most determined man in La Plata County." "That," he said with great dignity, "is exactly the word I prefer." She cut 2 slices and they had them with butter she kept in a small covered dish on her shelf, and Marcus watched her take the first bite of the honey wheat bread and close her eyes for just a moment, the way people do when something is genuinely good, and he thought that exact moment was the finest thing he had ever produced with his hands, and he had built his own fence line and pulled his own cattle and driven a herd 600 miles in one summer, and none of it compared to that single moment. July brought complications, as July often did. There was a man named Gideon Farr who arrived in Durango on the southbound stage in the second week of July. He was 34, well-dressed by the standards of 1882 Colorado, which meant his coat was newer than most, and his boots had been recently polished. He was a land speculator, or said he was, though Sheriff Dade had a quiet word with his deputy about keeping an eye on the man because speculators in that part of Colorado in 1882 had a tendency to be something more complicated than they presented. Farr took a room at the hotel, and within 3 days had identified Maude Rhodes's building as a property of interest. The building itself, which had belonged to her uncle, sat on a corner lot that was worth considerably more than the boot shop operating inside it, and Farr had an investor in Denver who wanted corner lots in growing railroad towns. He came into the shop on a Wednesday morning, very polite, very smooth, with a card and an offer. Maude listened to the offer, asked 2 or 3 precise questions, and then said she was not interested and thanked him for his time. Farr smiled and said he understood and left the card on her counter, and Maude dropped the card in the waste bin before he was out the door. Marcus did not know about any of this until Friday. When Maude told him, her voice was even and her hands were busy with a harness buckle she was reinforcing, and her tone was the tone of a woman reporting facts without asking for intervention, because Maude Rhodes did not ask for intervention. But Marcus sat with his coffee and thought about a smooth man in a new coat looking at Maude's shop the way a man looks at something he intends to acquire, and he felt a slow, steady anger build in his chest like coals being stoked. "He will come back," Marcus said. "Probably," Maude agreed. "He will offer more the second time. And I will say no the second time," she said. She looked up at him. "The building is not for sale. My uncle left it to me because he wanted me to have something that was mine. I am not selling it because a man in a new coat thinks I cannot read the terms of an offer." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "What was wrong with the terms?" She raised an eyebrow. "He lowballed by about 40% and buried a clause about tenant clearance that would have given his investor the right to vacate any existing business within 60 days of purchase." Marcus was quiet. Then slowly he said, "Where did you learn to read a land contract?" "My uncle was not just a bootmaker," she said. "He was a very careful man. He taught me to read everything twice." Marcus picked up his coffee cup. "Maude," he said. "Marcus," she said in exactly the same tone. "You are the most capable person in this town," he said. She looked at him, and for a moment something shifted in her expression, something soft that she did not usually show, something that was not the capable woman or the businesswoman or the woman who had come 900 miles to prove something. Just Maude. "That is a generous thing to say," she said. "It is also accurate," he said. Farr came back on Monday with a higher offer. Maude said no. Farr's politeness developed a harder edge, and he said something about how a woman alone could not realistically maintain a property of this value long-term. Maude looked at him with her steady brown eyes and said that she had been managing her finances since she was 15 years old, and she was quite capable of determining what she could maintain long-term. And she thanked him again for his time, and Farr left. He went to the Silver Horn that evening and made some comments at the bar that were not complimentary about women in business, and 3 different men who drank at the Silver Horn told him to keep his opinions to himself, which was not what Farr had expected from a Western saloon. Pete Doyle was one of the 3, and he came home that night and told Marcus what had happened, and Marcus sat on his porch steps in the dark for a while and looked at the stars and thought about what kind of town Durango was, and felt, for the first time in a while, actively glad to be in it. Farr left 2 weeks later, presumably to find a corner lot whose owner could be more easily pressured. Sheriff Dade watched the stage carry him south with an expression of mild satisfaction, and then went back inside his office. August arrived and the San Juan mountains shimmered in heat haze, and Marcus kept coming on Tuesdays and Fridays with bread, and the pattern of their mornings together had become something he could not imagine Tuesdays or Fridays without. He had learned that she took her coffee strong and without sugar, that she had strong opinions about the quality of waxed thread, that she had read more books than anyone else he had met in Colorado, that she had a younger sister still in St. Louis, that she had been briefly engaged at 22 to a man who had ultimately decided he wanted a wife who would stop working when they married, and that the engagement had ended without apparent regret on her part. He had told her about Kansas, about his father, about his mother, about the long years of trail work that had built him piece by piece into something different from what he had started as. He had told her things he had not told Pete, had not told the men he had worked with across 8 years. She listened with that full, present quality that made honesty feel safe. What he had not told her was the most obvious thing. He had not told her that he had learned to bake bread because he needed a reason to knock on her door. He had not told her that he thought about her in the mornings when the light came up over the mountains and turned the pasture gold. He had not told her that some evenings, sitting on his porch steps, he reached a point of wanting to say something and then stopped himself, because what he felt for her was so large and so serious that he was afraid of doing it badly, afraid of the words coming out wrong and landing wrong, and breaking the particular beautiful thing that their Tuesday and Friday mornings had become. Maude, for her part, was not oblivious. She was the opposite of oblivious. She had catalogued, with her usual careful attention, every detail of Marcus Ramsey across the 5 months she had known him. She had noted that he was honest to an almost uncomfortable degree, that his hands were careful with small things, that he had never once, in all their mornings together, looked at her the way some of the other men in town looked at her, with the assessing gaze of someone computing her marital availability and suitability, but instead looked at her the way he looked when she was telling him something, which was with complete attention, the way you look at something you find genuinely important. She had also noted that he had clearly, obviously been baking bread specifically to come see her, and that he had never said so directly, and she had found this both endearing and, by August, slightly maddening. She told her sister about him in a letter. Her sister's name was Clara, and Clara was 23 and practical, and wrote back from St. Louis with the following observation: "You have described this man for 4 letters in a row without once describing what anyone would call a simple friendship. Either tell him or stop writing to me about him, because you are making me emotional and I have work to do." Maude folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket and thought about Clara's advice for 3 days. On a Friday morning in late August, Marcus arrived with a loaf of rye bread, a new experiment, darker and denser than the sourdough and smelling of something ancient and deeply warm. He knocked on the door at his usual time, 8:30, and Maude opened it and he held out the bread and said, "Rye this time. I found a recipe in a book Mrs. Heller lent me." Maude looked at the bread. She looked at him. She said, "Marcus, come in," and he came in and she put the bread on the counter and turned around and said, with the directness that was simply her natural state, "I would like to ask you something." "All right," he said. He held his hat in both hands. "Why did you start bringing me bread?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hat. He looked up at her. He said, "Because I needed a reason to knock on your door." She had known this, essentially, for months. But hearing it said aloud, plain and simple and without decoration, did something to her chest that she had not quite anticipated. She was a composed woman by nature and by necessity. She had needed to be composed for years, but composure, she was discovering, had its limits when a man who looked at her the way Marcus did stood in her shop doorway saying true things in a quiet voice. "You did not need a reason," she said. "You could have simply knocked." "No," he said, "I could not have, not without something to offer. You could have offered conversation. You are good at conversation." "I did not know that yet when I started." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "You have been coming here for 5 months, Marcus." "I know." "You have brought me," she counted on her fingers, "sourdough, honey wheat, oat bread, cornbread, a savory herb loaf that I think had rosemary in it, and now rye." "The cornbread was not my best work," he admitted. "The cornbread was fine," she said. "Marcus." She said his name again, softer, and he straightened slightly, and she said, "I would very much like it if you asked me to walk with you on Sunday." He stared at her for a moment. Then he said, "Would you like to walk with me on Sunday, Maude?" "Yes," she said, "I would." He put his hat back on his head. He took it off again immediately because he was inside. He said, "I will come at 10. "I will be ready," she said. He left, and Maude stood in the middle of her shop floor and pressed both hands flat against her leather apron and breathed slowly for 30 seconds. And then she cut a slice of the rye bread and ate it standing up. And it was very good. It was the best thing he had brought her yet, and she thought she would tell him so on Sunday. The Sunday walk happened on a morning that was warm but edged with the first hint of the autumn that was coming. That smell of changing air that the mountains bring down in late August that tells you summer is not eternal. Marcus came at 10 on the dot, and Maude had put on a dress that was not a work dress, a dark green one with small cream buttons, and she had her hair pinned up, and she came out of the shop door, and Marcus stood at the bottom of the step and looked at her, and then very deliberately looked at the street, because otherwise his face would show too much. They walked south along the river, the Animas River, which ran clear and cold below the town over pale gray stones, and the cottonwoods along the banks were beginning to think about turning. Durango's streets fell away behind them, and the world opened up into the wide valley, and they walked at a comfortable pace and talked about everything and nothing. He told her about a problem he was having with one of his cows, a particular cow he had named, against all professional wisdom, Beatrice, who had a tendency to find gaps in fencing that no other cow could detect. Maude laughed at the name, and he told her that the cow had simply looked like a Beatrice, and he had been unable to help himself. She told him about a letter from her sister Clara, about Clara's job at a dry goods store in St. Louis, about Clara's opinion that Maude had gone completely crazy to move to Colorado. Was she right? Marcus asked. Maude considered the river for a moment, the way it moved over the stones, always moving, always arriving at somewhere new. No, she said, this is the most right I have felt in years. They walked until noon and then turned back. At the door of her shop he stopped and she stopped, and they stood in the Sunday quiet of the street, and he said, I would like to do this again. So would I, she said. Next Sunday. Yes. He looked at her for a moment with that full, serious attention that she had catalogued so carefully, and then he said, Maude, I want to be clear about something. I'm not coming here just for the walking. I know, she said. I am coming because I would like to be with you. In whatever way is right for you. I am not in any hurry. She looked at him. She thought about Clara's letter and about 5 months of bread and about what it meant that a man who was good at patience had nonetheless learned to bake solely for the purpose of having something to bring her. She said, I am glad you knocked on my door, Marcus. So am I, he said, even though the first loaf nearly sent up a smoke signal. She laughed again, that water-over-rock laugh, and he walked to his horse with his heart absolutely full. The Sunday walks became as regular as the Tuesday and Friday bread. They walked the river, walked the edge of town, walked up into the lower foothills where the scrub oak was turning red and gold as September came on. They talked and they were quiet, and both were equally comfortable, which is the sign of something real. In the third week of September, walking a trail above town with the valley spread out below them and the mountains going from green to russet to purple-gray in the distance, Marcus stopped and Maude stopped beside him, and they stood looking at the view, and he reached out and took her hand. It was a simple thing. His hand was large and calloused and warm, and her hand was smaller and just as calloused from the awl and the hammer, and their fingers settled together with the ease of two things that had been heading toward each other for a long time. She did not take her hand away. She leaned, very slightly, into his arm. They stood there for a while looking at Colorado laid out before them, and neither of them said anything, because nothing needed to be said. Walking back down into town, they were still holding hands, and Mrs. Calloway, who was constitutionally incapable of not being on her porch, saw them coming down the main street, and her entire face became one enormous smile. She said nothing, which from Mrs. Calloway constituted active restraint and something close to nobility. October came in with its specific perfection, the Colorado fall that people who have experienced it cannot adequately describe to people who have not, the specific quality of the light through aspen leaves gone gold, the cold clarity of the air, the way the mountains seem to come closer in autumn as if they want to be part of things. Marcus's cattle were fat and healthy going into the season, and he had sold 20 head at good price in September, which gave him a comfortable margin going into winter. Maude's boot shop was doing steadier business than the town had expected, partly because she was good and partly because word had spread to neighboring ranches and settlements that there was a capable repair shop in Durango now. On a Saturday in mid-October, Marcus came to town not with bread, though he had brought bread as well, but with a question that he had been turning over for 3 weeks. He knocked on Maude's door and she opened it, and he said, before he could lose his nerve, Maude, I would like you to see the ranch. She looked at him. All right, she said. Sunday I will cook you dinner. Her mouth quirked. You bake bread and now you cook. I have been practicing, he said with great dignity, and she laughed and said yes. He spent Saturday cleaning his house with the thoroughness of a man who has been a bachelor for too long and knows it. He swept the floors. He beat the rug. He washed the curtains, which had not been washed in approximately 2 years. Pete watched this activity from a safe distance and said nothing because he valued his life. He cooked a pot roast on Saturday night so it would be ready by Sunday noon, and he baked a fresh loaf of sourdough Sunday morning. And when Maude arrived on a rented horse from the livery stable, wearing her riding clothes, a split skirt and a dark jacket and her hair in a practical braid, Marcus was standing at the gate of the ranch, and he thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen against the backdrop of his own land. She liked the ranch. He could tell because she asked real questions, not polite questions, but the questions of someone actually curious. She wanted to know about the pasture rotation, about where he got his water in dry years, about how many hands he employed. She walked along the fence line with him and looked at the cattle with the attentive eye of someone who had learned to look at things seriously. And she said Beatrice was easy to identify because she had a particular independent way of standing that was distinct from the rest of the herd. "You can tell that from here," he said. "I notice things," she said simply. They ate at his kitchen table, which he had set with his 2 best plates and a cloth that had belonged to his mother and that he kept in a trunk. The pot roast was good. The bread was very good. She ate with the unceremonious appetite of someone who actually works for a living and does not pretend to eat like a bird at someone else's table. He found this enormously appealing. After dinner, they sat on his porch in the October afternoon sun with coffee, and Copper the dog settled at Maude's feet with the complete certainty of an animal that has selected its preferred person, and she scratched him behind the ears without comment, as if large shaggy dogs settling at her feet was entirely expected. The mountains were very clear in the late afternoon light, their snow-capped peaks catching the low sun and holding it. "It is beautiful out here," she said. "Yes," he said, and looked at her. She caught the look and held his gaze steady and direct and said, "Marcus, what are you thinking?" He had been honest with her from the beginning in the particular way that their relationship had been built on honesty, not performed honesty but the real kind that costs something. So he said, "I am thinking that I would like you to be here more often." She was quiet for a moment. Copper shifted under her hand. The mountains held their light. "That is a significant thing to say," she said. "I know it is," he said. "I am not rushing you. I want to be clear about that. I know you have built something in town. I know the shop is yours and it matters." "It does matter," she said. "I know." Looked at his coffee cup. "I am 31 years old and I have never wanted anything the way I want a life with you. I wanted to be clear about that too." Maude set her coffee cup down on the porch rail and turned to look at him fully. He met her eyes. They sat there in the October light on his porch with the mountains at their backs and looked at each other, and she said, "I came to Durango to build something of my own. That was the whole of it. I was not looking for anything else." "I know," he said. "And then you knocked on my door with bread," she said. "And you were so terrible at small talk for the first 10 minutes that I found you genuinely charming." He blinked. "I was terrible at small talk. You told me the exact diameter of a fence post hole before we had been sitting down for 4 minutes, she said. He thought about this. "That is a relevant fact about ranching," he said. "It absolutely is," she said, and smiled, a full one, both of them now, these smiles coming more often and more easily between them. "Marcus, I am not going anywhere. I am right where I mean to be. And you are part of that. You have been part of that for months. If you had been paying attention, you would know I have not been waiting for you to find a different reason to knock on my door." He sat with this for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "I have been paying attention." "Then you know," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know." The afternoon deepened around them and they stayed on the porch until the sun was going behind the western ridge and the air turned cold with that particular mountain evening speed, and he brought out a blanket from inside, and they sat close together under it, her shoulder against his arm, watching the stars begin to appear one at a time over the dark line of the peaks. November came and the first real snow came with it, the kind that coats everything softly and turns the world quiet. Durango in the snow was a different place, smaller and warmer feeling. the smoke from every chimney going up in the still cold air. Maude's shop stayed open through the winter because, as she pointed out to anyone who commented on it, Boots did not take winter off. Marcus came on Tuesdays and Fridays still, and on Sundays when the weather allowed. On the days when the snow was too deep for a comfortable ride from the ranch, he would write her letters, which was something he discovered he was actually good at. He had not expected to be good at letter writing, but the same quality that had made him good at finding words in her back room, the care he took with honesty, translated well to paper. She wrote back. Her letters were dry and funny and precise, and occasionally contained small sketches in the margins, quick ink drawings of whatever was in her mind. A boot with a challenging heel, Copper as she remembered him from Sunday at the ranch. A mountain drawn in 3 strokes that somehow captured the particular way the San Juans looked in winter. He kept every letter. He kept them in a box that had held his mother's sewing thread, which was the most careful container he owned. In December, 2 things happened that altered the course of things considerably. The first was that Clara, Maude's sister in St. Louis, wrote to say she was engaged to a man who ran a printing press, and that she intended to marry in March and hoped Maude might come back for the wedding. Maude sat with this letter for an evening and felt many things at once: happiness for Clara, a complicated ache about the distance, and something else that she examined carefully and identified as a measurement of how fully she had made Colorado her home, because the idea of going back, even for a week, felt like going backward. She told Marcus about the letter on a Friday, sitting in the back room with coffee and a loaf of oat bread that was his most consistent recipe now, the one he had fully mastered, and she said she was glad for Clara and was not sure about the trip. He listened. He said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to be there for her wedding," she said, "and I want to come back here after." "Then do that," he said, as if it were simple because for him it was. "Write to her and tell her you will be there." "March is not far. I will manage the shop." She looked at him. "You will manage my boot shop." "I will watch the building," he corrected with precision. "I am not attempting to repair boots. That is a skilled trade and I know my limits." She laughed and he thought, "I will miss this when she goes to St. Louis. I will miss this specific sound every single day." The second thing that happened in December was that Pete Doyle told Marcus, on a cold Tuesday evening in the bunkhouse with the stove going full and the snow ticking against the window, that he was planning to head south in spring, possibly to New Mexico, possibly further. He had a cousin in Las Cruces, and he had a mind to try something different. He delivered this news with a combination of apology and excitement, because Pete was genuinely fond of Marcus and did not want to leave him short-handed, but he was 24 years old and New Mexico was pulling at him. Marcus told him he understood, which he did, entirely. He had been 24 and pulled toward something once himself. He told Pete there would always be work for him if he came back and meant it, and they shook hands on it. He would need to find a new hand for spring. He added it to the list of things he was thinking about. What he was thinking about more, in the long evenings of December with the fire going and the snow outside and the ranch quiet, was the shape of the future. He had been thinking about it since October, since the day on the porch with the mountains and the blanket and Maude's shoulder against his arm. He had a clear picture of what he wanted. He was a man who, when he knew what he wanted, went about getting it with the patient, determined method that Mrs. Calloway had correctly identified as his dominant characteristic. He wanted Maude Rhodes. He wanted her as his wife and his partner, and the person sitting across from him at that kitchen table for the rest of his life. He wanted to keep making bread and watching her eat it and talking about fence posts and boot repair, and the books she was reading and the letters from Clara and the stars over the mountains. He also knew that Maude was not a woman to be rushed, and more importantly, not a woman to be managed. She had built something of her own. She had come 900 miles to have something that was hers. Any proposal he made would need to account for that, would need to make room for it, would need to be about addition rather than replacement. He spent December thinking about how to do it right. Christmas in Durango in 1882 was a community affair. The two churches held services, and there was a gathering at the schoolhouse with food brought potluck style, and a fiddle player named Edmonds who could play for 4 hours without stopping. Maude brought a honey cake from a recipe she had gotten from Mrs. Heller, and Marcus brought 4 loaves of his sourdough because he had been asked to, specifically, by 3 different people who had eaten his bread at various social occasions throughout the fall. He stood beside her in the schoolhouse, both of them with plates, and thought about the fact that 5 months ago he had not existed to her, and now they stood together at community events as a natural fact. Edmund struck up a reel and several couples moved to the open space, and Marcus, who had not danced since approximately 1876, looked at Maude and she looked at him, and before either of them had technically asked or answered, they were on the floor, and she could dance, which did not surprise him at all, and he was less terrible at it than he had expected, and they danced 2 reels and a slower piece and came off the floor a little flushed and laughing, and Sheriff Dade, watching from the corner with a cup of punch, said to his wife quietly, "About time," and his wife said, "Thomas, honestly," but she was smiling when she said it. January came cold and hard, the way Colorado Januaries do, with several days where the temperature dropped so far that the water in the barrel by Marcus's back door froze solid overnight. He kept the cattle closer to the barn, put out extra hay, made sure the water troughs were broken of ice every morning. The ranch in winter required a particular vigilance. He rode to town when he could, which was most weeks, the trail from the ranch into Durango being well established enough that moderate snow did not close it. He and Maude had developed a habit on these winter visits of staying longer, the cold outside making the warmth of her back room more precious, the short days giving their conversations a compressed intensity. He had been thinking all December about how to propose. He had found, in early January, what he believed was the right approach. He came on a Friday in the second week of January with bread, as usual, and they had coffee, as usual, and he waited until they had talked through their immediate news, the cattle, the shop, Clara's wedding plans, and then he said, "Maude, there is something I want to talk to you about." She looked at him over her coffee cup. She was very still in the way she got when she was paying close attention. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said, "but I want to say something first, and I want you to listen to the whole of it before you say anything." She set her cup down. She folded her hands on the table. She waited. "I know what the boot shop means to you," he said. "I know you did not come here to trade one life for another life that is smaller. I know you have built something real and it is yours, and no part of my wanting to marry you is about changing that. The shop stays. You keep it. You run it however you see fit. I would not dream of asking you to put it aside." He looked at her steadily. "What I am asking is whether you might be willing to let what you are building here include me, in whatever shape makes sense. We can figure out the rest together." Maude looked at him for a long moment. The stove ticked. Outside, January was solid and white and still. "You understand," she said carefully, "that I would need the shop to remain mine in every practical sense, not just as a courtesy." "Yes," he said. "And you understand that I am not a woman who will stop having opinions about things once she is married." "Maude," he said, "I fell in love with your opinions. Stopping them would be like stopping the river." Her expression did something he had not seen it do before, something that was somewhere between being moved and being amused and being absolutely certain all at once. She said, "Marcus Ramsey." "Maude Rhodes," he said. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He sat very still for a moment, as if he needed to make sure he had heard correctly. Then something happened to his face that Pete, had he been there, would have recognized as the expression his boss never let anyone see, pure and unguarded joy, the kind that comes from having wanted something carefully and completely for a long time, and then getting it. He reached across the table, and she gave him her hand, and he held it in both of his, and they sat there in the warm back room of the boot shop with the winter outside, and everything else that existed settled around them into the right shape. They were married in March of 1883, the same month Clara married her printer in St. Louis. Maude went to St. Louis in late February and came back with Clara, who had insisted on coming to Durango for her sister's wedding before returning east for her own. Clara was small and bright-eyed and looked like Maude if Maude had been made with slightly more laughter and slightly less iron, and she and Marcus shook hands the morning after she arrived, and she looked him up and down with frank assessment and said, "She wrote about you for 4 months before she mentioned your name." Marcus looked at Maude, who was watching Clara with an expression of patient exasperation. "Is that right?" he said. "She described a man who was interesting and kind and brought her bread," Clara continued, with the relentless energy of a younger sister who has waited for this moment. "And I kept writing back asking what his name was, and she kept saying it did not matter yet." "Clara," Maude said, in a tone that had its limits. "I just think it is charming," Clara said, and smiled at Marcus with a warmth that was entirely genuine, and Marcus liked her immediately and completely. The wedding was held at the smaller of Durango's 2 churches on a Saturday morning, with the last of the winter releasing its grip and the first tentative signs of spring showing in the willows along the river. Mrs. Calloway wore her best hat and cried openly and without any apparent embarrassment. Sheriff Dade and his wife came. The Hellers came. Edmonds, the fiddle player, played outside the church afterward. Pete Doyle, who had not yet left for New Mexico, stood up as Marcus's witness and shook his hand afterward and said, "Boss, this is the best thing that has happened on the Ramsey Ranch in my 3 years there." And Marcus said, "I know," and meant it without reservation. Clara stood beside Maude and made it through the ceremony dry-eyed, and then cried through the entire reception, which she said was simply the natural result of attending 2 weddings in 2 months. Maude wore a dress that was the dark gold color of turned leaves, not white because she was a practical woman, and a white dress was not practical for life in Durango. And she carried a small bunch of early wildflowers that Marcus had ridden into the lower hills to find before dawn that morning. She stood next to him at the altar and looked at him with her clear brown eyes and said her vows in a steady voice, and Marcus said his in a voice that was steady until the last few words, and then it was not quite, and she noticed, and the look she gave him when they were pronounced married was the most private look he had ever received from any person, something meant only for him. They walked out of the church into the thin March sunlight as Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey, and Maude kept her name professionally. Rhodes Boot Repair remained Rhodes Boot Repair, which everyone in town understood and accepted with minimal commentary, and those who had commentary kept it to themselves, because the sheriff's wife had made it clear she had opinions about people who had opinions about Maude's professional choices. Clara stayed a week, and then went back to St. Louis. At the stage, she hugged Maude for a long time and then shook Marcus's hand again and said, "Write to me." "I will," he said. "Not just Maude," Clara clarified. "You too." "She says your letters are better than hers, which is a significant claim." He wrote to Clara the following week and the week after that, and a correspondence began between them that would continue for years, warm and funny, and full of the small details of 2 lives being lived in different places. Spring arrived in full force by April, and the Ramsey Ranch came alive with the season's particular demands. Marcus hired a new hand, a young man named Edwin Marsh, who was 20 years old and had come up from Texas looking for steady work, and who proved to be reliable and good with horses and refreshingly unopinionated about things that were not his business. Maude met Edwin the first time she came out to the ranch after the wedding, and she said hello and Edwin said ma'am, and that was the whole of that, which was exactly as much as was needed. Maude rode out to the ranch on Sundays now, and Marcus came to town on Tuesdays and Fridays, though now the Friday visit usually ended with them having supper together in the back room of the shop and Marcus riding home in the dark, which he had done all winter without complaint, and continued to do without complaint now. The arrangement of the shop and the ranch, two separate things connected by two people who trusted each other completely, worked because they had built it to work, because they had talked about it honestly before they agreed to it and kept talking about it honestly as they went. Maude ran her shop. She hired a young woman in April named Dolly Fint to help with the front counter on busy days, Dolly being 16 and cheerful and good with customers if not yet reliable with an all. Marcus ran his cattle. They talked every day they were together and wrote letters on the days they were not. In June of 1883, Maude told Marcus she was expecting a child. She told him on a Sunday at the ranch, sitting on the porch where they had sat the previous October with the blanket and the stars, and the summer air was warm and the mountains were green, and she said it plainly, the way she said everything, and watched his face. His face did something that had no name. He looked at her for a moment, and then he reached out and took both her hands in both of his and held them, and he said nothing for a moment that stretched and stretched, and then he said very quietly, "Are you well?" "Entirely," she said. "Are you frightened?" She considered this honestly, which was her way. "Somewhat," she said, "but not more than I can manage." "We will manage it together," he said, and the simplicity of it, not a promise of impossibilities but just the plain commitment of not being alone in it, was exactly what she needed to hear. The baby came in January of 1884, which was not, Marcus thought afterward, the most convenient month for arrivals, given the state of Colorado winters, but the baby was not consulted on the scheduling. He was born on a Thursday morning, a boy, 7 pounds and fully alarmed by the world and expressing this alarm vocally, and Mrs. Calloway, who had appointed herself midwife's assistant on the grounds that someone needed to and she had experience, brought him out of the back room of the house. They had moved Maude to the ranch for the final weeks of her pregnancy, and she put him into Marcus's arms, and Marcus stood in his kitchen, holding a person he had helped make, and felt the entire architecture of himself rearrange around this new fact. They named him James, after Marcus's grandfather, who had been the one person in his father's family worth naming a child after. James Ramsey came into the world with a quantity of dark hair and his mother's brown eyes, and his father's particular way of looking at things as if he was already figuring them out. Maude was back at the shop, part-time, by February. This was, she acknowledged to Marcus, perhaps slightly ambitious, and he said he thought so too, and she said she was grateful for his opinion and was going back on Wednesday. He looked at her and thought about arguing and thought better of it and asked if she would take Edwin's horse instead of walking because the street ice was unpredictable. She said yes, she would take the horse, and he said thank you, and that was the extent of the negotiation. Dolly Fint, who was now 17 and considerably more skilled with an awl than she had been at 16, managed the shop on the days Maude was at the ranch with James, and Maude managed the shop on the days she was in town, and the arrangement was imperfect and human and worked reasonably well. By the spring of 1884, James was 3 months old and had developed a personality that was emphatically his own, loud when he wanted something and quietly observant when he did not, watching everything around him with those brown eyes. Copper, the dog, had appointed himself James's personal guardian and slept at the foot of the baby's cradle with an air of solemn responsibility. Clara came to visit in April, leaving her husband the printer in St. Louis, and spent 2 weeks at the ranch. She held James with the practiced ease of a woman who had clearly been practicing with someone's baby in preparation, and she and Maude sat on the porch in the April sun talking in the way that sisters talk, fast and layered, and full of shorthand, while Marcus worked the cattle with Edwin and checked in periodically with a cup of coffee, and the particular satisfied look of a man who has exactly the life he wanted around him. Clara told Marcus privately on her last evening there that Maude was the happiest she had ever seen her sister. She would not say that herself, Clara said. She would say she was content and functioning well and had a good arrangement, but what she means is happy. "I know," Marcus said. "I know you know," Clara said. I just wanted to say it out loud. The years that followed were the good years, the kind that accumulate into a life worth having. Marcus expanded the ranch in 1885, buying the adjoining 80 acres from a homesteader who had decided the mountains were not for him. The cattle herd grew to nearly 100 head. Edwin stayed on and proved himself more than good enough to be trusted with increased responsibility. And by 1886, Marcus had made him a permanent foreman arrangement rather than simple hired hand. And Edwin brought a wife, a young woman named Anna who had come west from Ohio with her family. And they built a small house on the eastern edge of the ranch property and became part of the daily fabric of the place. Rhodes Boot Repair continued to operate with steady success. Dolly Fint learned her trade properly, and in 1886, when she married a carpenter named Holt and moved to the far end of town, Maude replaced her with a young man named Ray who had come from a cobbler's family in New Mexico and had real training. The shop expanded into the neighboring storefront in 1887, adding a small goods section selling boot leather, laces, and other leather maintenance supplies, which Maude had been considering for 2 years and finally acted on when the space became available. In 1886, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Elizabeth, called Ellie almost from the first moment, who came into the world quieter than James and more watchful, and who would grow up with her mother's sharp eye and her father's patience and the particular confidence of a child who has been loved without condition. James, at 2.5 when Ellie arrived, treated his sister with the serious attentiveness of a child who has been told something important has occurred and is trying to understand its full significance. He spent the first week of her life standing beside her cradle looking at her with his brow furrowed in thought, and one afternoon Maude looked up from nursing Ellie to find James standing there with a small smooth river stone in his fist, which he placed carefully beside the cradle with the air of making an offering, and then turned and walked away with dignity. Marcus, who had seen this, said to Maude later, "Where does he get this from?" "You," she said, without hesitation. "I have never left a rock beside a cradle." "No, but you learn to bake bread to have a reason to knock on someone's door," she said. "He is your child." He looked at her. She was sitting in the rocking chair he had made for the nursery the previous fall in the lamplight with Ellie asleep against her chest, and she was looking at him with that full direct look that had been the first thing he had loved about her and remained the thing he loved most, the willingness to see and to say. "I love you, Maude," he said. "I know you do," she said. "I love you too. Come to bed." He went to bed. Outside, Colorado was dark and full of stars, and the ranch was quiet, the cattle settled, the dog at his post, the house warm with lamplight and sleeping children, and the daily enormous ordinary fact of a life built carefully by two people who had chosen each other on purpose. In 1888, Pete Doyle came back from New Mexico. He came on a summer afternoon, thinner than he had been and a little more weathered, and with a new scar on his chin from a horse-related incident. He described with the self-deprecating humor that had always been his characteristic. He knocked on the ranch house door and Marcus answered it, and they stood there for a moment, and then Marcus shook his hand and said, "I told you there would always be work." "I know," Pete said. "I am taking you up on it if the offer still stands." "It stands," Marcus said. "Come in and have dinner." Maude fed Pete and listened to his New Mexico stories, and asked him about his cousin in Las Cruces, and Pete answered everything, and looked around at the ranch house, at the two children who ate their supper with varying levels of table manners, at the way Marcus and Maude moved around each other in the kitchen with the ease of people who have shared a space for years and know each other's patterns without thinking about them. And he said, at one point, to no one in particular, "This is a fine thing you have here." James, who was 4.5 and had developed strong opinions about what constituted a fine thing, looked at Pete very seriously and said, "We have a dog too." "That is an important detail," Pete agreed. "His name is Copper and he sleeps by Ellie," James said. "How old is Ellie?" "2," James said. "She is mostly all right, but she takes my things sometimes." Pete looked at Marcus and Marcus looked at Pete, and both of them said nothing, because sometimes nothing is the right thing. Pete took back his old bunk in the barn house, which Edwin and Anna had improved considerably with a wooden floor and a proper stove, and he stayed. He had not been entirely sure he would stay when he knocked on the door. By the end of the first week, he was entirely sure. The summer of 1888 was long and golden, and without particular catastrophe, which Marcus privately considered a gift. He rode his land in the mornings and fixed fences with Edwin and Pete in the afternoons, and came home in the evenings to the house that smelled of bread and leather and children and coffee, and the particular complex warm smell of a home that is actually lived in. Maude came home from town most days by late afternoon now, and they had developed an evening pattern that was so familiar it had become the structure of days: supper together, children's bedtime, and then an hour or two on the porch in summer or by the fire in winter, talking or reading or simply sitting in companionable quiet. He still baked bread. He had never stopped. It was part of the rhythms of the ranch house now, the sourdough starter living in its crock on the kitchen shelf, fed and maintained, producing good bread twice a week. James had begun helping, standing on a stool beside the counter, and being given a piece of dough to work with his hands while his father shaped the loaf, and he was 4.5 and made bread that was entirely inedible but enormously satisfying to produce. Ellie stood and watched from her spot by the kitchen door with her arms folded in the way she had already developed, waiting to be old enough to participate. In October of 1888, on a clear cold afternoon with the aspens gone entirely gold and the air tasting of early winter, Marcus and Maude walked along the Animas River as they had done 6 years before when they were first finding each other. But now James trotted along ahead of them, and Ellie held Maude's free hand on one side and Marcus's hand on the other, and demanded to be swung between them every 40 steps or so, which they did. Because she asked, and because it made her laugh in a way that was completely worth it. They walked in the afternoon until the air got cold, and then they turned back toward home, the children tired and quieting, Ellie eventually agreeing to be carried on Marcus's shoulders, where she rode with queenly composure and her hands in his hair. At the gate of the ranch, Maude stopped for a moment and looked back at the mountains, the way she sometimes did, as if checking that they were still there. They were. They always were. The San Juan Mountains in October were the most specific beautiful thing she had ever seen regularly, and 6 years of seeing them had not reduced the impact. Marcus stopped beside her and looked at what she was looking at. James leaned against his father's leg, his hand curled in Marcus's coat pocket the way he did when he was tired. Ellie had fallen asleep on Marcus's shoulders, her cheek against the top of his head. "Are you thinking anything specific?" he said. It was a question he still asked her because she was still a person who thought specifically, and it was still worth knowing. "I am thinking," she said, "that I am glad you burned that bread." He looked at her. "Which time?" "The first time," she said. "The time Mrs. Calloway saw the smoke." "I did not burn that one," he said. "I burned the first 3. The one Mrs. Calloway saw was the one that just oversmoked because my oven runs hot." "Semantics," she said. "In my experience of baking, there is an important distinction between a burned loaf and an oversmoked one." She looked at him with that look that was a full smile now, had been for years, easy and unguarded and entirely his, and she said, "The important thing is that it was visible from 3 lots away, and I saw it, and I laughed, and I was watching you from the street." He thought about this. He had not known she had been watching. "Were you watching before the smoke?" "Marcus," she said, "I had been watching you ride past the shop for 2 weeks." He stood there for a moment with this information, with James asleep-weight against his leg and Ellie asleep-weight on his shoulders and the mountains at his back and his wife standing next to him in the October light. "You might have said so," he said. "You might have knocked on my door without bread," she said. "I told you I needed something to offer." "You had yourself," she said. "That was plenty." He looked at her for a long moment. 6 years and 2 children, and a cattle ranch that had doubled in size, and a boot shop that had expanded into 2 storefronts, and the letters and the Sunday walks and the porch evenings and the bread twice a week, and the letters to Clara and every Tuesday and Friday morning in the back room with coffee, all of it, accumulated into the specific weight and texture of a life that was absolutely, entirely theirs. "Maude," he said. "Marcus," she said. "I would like to go inside," he said. "It is getting cold." "Yes," she said, "let us go inside." They went through the gate and across the yard and into the house where the stove was warm, and the sourdough starter was doing what it always did on the kitchen shelf, alive and patient and ready. And Copper met them at the door and assessed the sleeping Ellie with professional concern before settling back to his spot by the hearth. And Marcus lifted Ellie down from his shoulders with careful hands, and she stirred but did not wake. And James went to bed with minimal argument, which was rarer than it should have been. And the house settled into its nighttime quiet. Later, with the children asleep and the fire low and good, they sat on the settle by the fire with her head against his shoulder, in the particular domestic intimacy of 2 people who have been building a life together for long enough that comfort is the most natural thing in the world. And she was reading one of her books, and he was doing nothing except existing in the same space as her, which remained, 6 years in, one of the things he most wanted to do with any given evening. "I am going to try a new bread next week," he said. She turned a page. "What kind?" "I found a recipe for a milk bread, softer crumb. Mrs. Anna brought it from Ohio." "I will try it," she said. "James will want to help." "James helps with everything," she said. "He is going to be insufferably competent at 12 if we do not find a way to slow him down." "He is his mother's son," Marcus said. She looked up from the book and gave him that look, the private one. The one that had been given to him alone since March of 1883, and that he had never taken for granted, not once, not even on the ordinary evenings, when it was simply them by the fire in the ranch house on the Colorado plain with the mountains outside, and the children asleep and the dog at the hearth, and the sourdough starter on the kitchen shelf and all of it. Every ordinary piece of it, exactly what they had built it to be. "Go to sleep, Marcus," she said. "Soon," he said. She went back to her book. He looked at the fire. Outside, the mountains held the dark. The ranch was quiet. The starter in its crock was alive and patient as it always was. Some things, once started, keep going. The milk bread turned out to be very good. James helped, which made it take 40 minutes longer than it should have. Ellie watched from the doorway with her arms folded until she decided she was old enough and came, and stood on the stool and put her small hands in the dough. And Marcus let her work it and showed her what the texture was supposed to feel like, elastic and smooth. A language communicated through touch, the same language he had discovered years ago in his kitchen, when he was learning something he had not expected to learn for reasons he had not expected to find. She felt it too, eventually. The moment when the dough was right under her hands. "Is that it?" she said, looking up at him. "That is it," he said. She looked back at the dough with serious satisfaction, and Marcus looked at the top of her head with its dark curls and thought that this, too, was a kind of starting. You put your hands into something, you learn its language, you keep going, and something good comes out of it. Maybe that was the whole of what he knew. Maybe that was enough. He thought it was more than enough. He thought it was everything. Outside, Durango was growing, as Colorado was growing, filling in and spreading out, the railroad having made it permanent in ways that the early settlers had hoped for. The San Juan Mountains stood where they had always stood, not changed by any of it, patient as mountains are patient, as certain things are certain. The Animas River ran clear and cold over its pale stones, always arriving at somewhere new. On a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1889, Marcus Ramsey put a fresh loaf of sourdough in a clean cloth and rode to town. It was reflex now, pure habit, the pattern of all the years, and he hitched his horse at the rail on Main Street and went into Rhodes' boot repair with the bread under his arm, and the bell above the door rang as it always did, and Maude looked up from the counter and said, "Good morning, Marcus." "Good morning, Maude," he said. He put the bread on the counter. She unwrapped it and pressed one finger to the crust and said, "Good loaf." "They are all good now," he said, with a modesty that was also entirely accurate. She cut 2 slices and put the kettle on, and he leaned on the counter and they talked, and the morning light came through the shop window the way it always did, and the mountains were where they always were, and the bread was good, and they were exactly where they meant to be. The bread was always an excuse, and it was never an excuse. It was a reason, and it remained a reason, and the reason had kept growing into something larger than a reason, into the whole architecture of a life, into 2 children and a cattle ranch and a boot shop, and Sunday walks and porch evenings and letters to Clara and the sourdough starter alive in its crock, and all the ordinary Tuesday and Friday mornings that were worth more than most people knew how to count. He had knocked on her door with bread, and she had let him in, and everything that followed had been the natural and specific consequence of 2 people who paid attention to the right things, who were honest when honesty was hard, who understood that what you build with your hands and your patience and your willingness to learn something new is worth more than anything you are simply given. The bell above the door rang every time it opened, announcing whoever had just come in from the street, and every Tuesday and Friday morning for the rest of their years in Durango, that bell rang for Marcus Ramsey, who came with bread, as he had always come with bread, because that was how it had started, and because some things that start right go on being right in ways you could not have imagined at the beginning, which is the best thing that can happen to a person, and which happened, specifically and entirely, to both of them.